And we're going to continue with the 8th chapter of The Spell of the Sorcerer's Skull. Johnny, Father Higgins, and Fergie are on their way to Cemetery Island, the last known living place of Warren Windrow, who was the man who attacked Lucius Childermass and was hung for it. Johnny could not, for the life of him, imagine how all this was going to end, but as he sat there with the motorboat hurtling along under him, he knew that he was getting more nervous by the minute. Part of this was because of his fear of riding a speeding boat, but there was more to it than that. Johnny kept thinking of the skull. He couldn't keep his mind off it. The grinning, evil little object was gone again. It had vanished into the void where dark things wait until witchcraft calls them forth. Without a doubt, the silver crucifix had driven the skull away. But could it keep the skull away? What if the skull reappeared at some time when he least expected it? Johnny brooded about the skull. He closed his eyes and wished fervently that he had never heard of the Childermass Clock or Cemetery Island or Penobscot Bay. "There it is!" Fergie yelled, pointing into the darkness ahead. Johnny forced his eyes open and twisted his head around. Looming closer and closer was a dark, shadowy mass. He couldn't make out any details. It was pitch black out here in the middle of the bay. The drone of the motor grew softer as Father Higgins aimed the boat in toward the shore. Then the engine noise died altogether, and they coasted in. Johnny felt a rough shudder and heard a grumbling of sand under his feet. They had landed. Awkwardly, the tall priest stood up and swung himself out of the boat. He was calf-deep in water, but he didn't seem to mind. Fergie leaped nimbly out and began tugging at the gunwales of the boat. By then, he noticed that Johnny was still sitting there, rigidly staring at nothing. For a second, Fergie looked worried, but then he grinned, reached up and slapped Johnny hard on the knee. "Hey, Dixon!" he yelled loudly. "Off your duff and on your feet! How are we going to drag the boat in if you sit there weighing it down? Come on! Afraid you get your feet wet? Your grandma tell you you'd catch a cold if your tootsies got damp?" Fergie was being nasty and sarcastic on purpose. He was a bit scared of the way Johnny was acting, and he figured it might be best to jolt him into action. "Huh? Oh, yeah," muttered Johnny in a dazed, thick voice. He lurched to his feet and clambered over the side of the rowboat. The icy cold of the water gripped his legs, and he winced. But he bit his lip to keep from yelling. He wanted to prove he was just as tough as the other two. Moving to the front of the boat, he gripped the iron ring that hung from the prow, and he tugged. The others were shoving, too, and the boat slid up onto the gravelly beach. They walked a few steps over the wet sand, and then stopped to stare at the island. Pine trees grew close to the shore, and beyond rose shelves of granite. The wind was picking up now, and the pines waved to and fro, making an eerie, keening noise. Then lightning flashed again in the distance, and Father Higgins swore under his breath. "We're going to get rained on, gentlemen," he growled. "I'm kind of glad I thought of that tarpaulin. We might just possibly be in need of it." He turned, put his hands on his hips, and peered into the murky shadows of the island. "Well, Prof," he said loudly, "I sure hope you're here. Comin' ready or not, like us kids used to say." After this little speech, Father Higgins turned abruptly back from the boat and fumbled under the tarpaulin. He came up with the 3 flashlights, and, with a jaunty flick of his wrist, he sent one flying into Fergie's outstretched hands. Johnny caught the other one. "I wonder if we ought to have brought our raincoats," said Johnny fretfully, as he switched on the light. He had a fear of dampness, and he was always fussing about it. Fergie snickered, and Johnny bit his lip ruefully. Why did he say things like that? Like most timid people, Johnny wanted to be brave and resourceful and cunning. Why couldn't he just shrug off fears the way other people did? Then he reminded himself that he was here on the island, after all, with the other two, so maybe he wasn't quite as cowardly as he thought he was. With flashlights shining, Fergie, Johnny, and Father Higgins tramped up the beach and plunged into the scrubby little clump of pines. They found a narrow, winding path that was covered with dead pine needles and decided to follow it. On the other side of the pine grove, the rugged, uneven ground of the island opened out before them. It was too dark to see much, but here and there were dark blotches that might be bushes. And there were rocks. Johnny kept tripping over them as he picked his way along. The 3 of them marched on in silence for some time, while the wind whistled around them, and big, splashing raindrops started to fall. Suddenly, Father Higgins let out an exclamation. "Hey, would you look at that? Up there!" Johnny and Fergie looked. Far ahead in the darkness was a tiny yellow blot of light, a lamp in a window, maybe. "Come on, boys," yelled Father Higgins, waving them ahead excitedly. "This miserable little hunk of real estate isn't supposed to have anybody living on it. But where there's light, there's life, or so they say. Let's see." The three of them walked faster now. Fergie and Father Higgins swung right along. They did not seem to be having any trouble with the uneven stony field. But it was another story for Johnny. He banged his shin on a tree stump, and a little later he stepped into a hole that gave his ankle a vicious twist. "Ow!" yelled Johnny as his foot sank into the hole. "That hurts! It hurts!" Father Higgins and Fergie were a few paces ahead of him. They stopped and turned their flashlight beams on their friend. "Hey, John," Fergie called. "Are you okay?" Johnny did not reply immediately. He yanked his foot out of the hole. Then he took a careful, gingerly step and sucked in his breath with a sharp, painful hiss. It was agony to walk. Gritting his teeth, he forced himself to take another step. The second step felt just as miserable as the first had, but at least he could move. Hobbling, he made it to where the other two were standing. Father Higgins laid his hand on Johnny's arm. "How are you, John? What does it feel like?" Johnny forced himself to stare straight into the priest's eyes. It's okay," he said in a strained voice. This, of course, was a lie. His ankle felt as if somebody were toasting it over a bonfire, but he wasn't going to be left out of the search. A long time ago, somebody had told him that your ankle wasn't broken if you could still walk. Well, he could walk, and that was all that mattered for now. You're sure you're all right?" asked Father Higgins. He sounded worried. "I'm fine, Father. It hurts a little, but not much." Father Higgins gave Johnny a friendly pat on the back. "Okay, then, we're off. Forward at the gallop, as they say in the cavalry movies." The three of them tramped on. The long white beams of their flashlights picked out a low fieldstone wall, and behind it, long rows of pale white slabs that marched up a hillside, the graveyard for which Cemetery Island was named. Beyond the wall, the ground rose steadily. Johnny could see a ruddy little road rising into the darkness. At the top was the shadow of a building, a chapel maybe, and there was a lighted window. As Johnny watched, a shadow passed over the light. Somebody was in there, moving around. "Holy St. Patrick!" whispered Father Higgins in an awestruck voice. "I wonder if... Well, come on. What are we waiting for?" At the entrance to the cemetery was a rusting iron turnstile. It creaked and squealed loudly as the three of them shoved through it. Hobbling badly now, feeling agony in every step and sweat streaming down his face, Johnny struggled to keep up with his friends. Up the road they ran. As they got nearer to the top, they could see that the building was indeed a chapel, a tiny brick church with quatrefoil decorations on the front and a pointed door with a cross over it. One of the long, narrow windows was boarded up, but the other was open, and light was streaming out of it. Father Higgins got to the door first. He jerked it open, and a bar of light fell across the road. Then the priest took a step backwards and just stood there, dead still. Johnny and Fergie crowded in next to him to look. The inside of the little chapel was a mess. Wooden pews were stacked in a corner, and everything seemed to be covered with gritty dust and dirt. The altar at the rear had been used as a dinner table. A checkered tablecloth was thrown over it, and on it lay a dirty plate with a half-eaten piece of bread and a battered tin cup. Near the cup and plate stood an oil lamp that cast a yellowish, smoky light. A few paces from the altar stood an old-fashioned iron cook-stove, and in one corner was a dirty striped mattress with an old threadbare blanket wadded up on it and a rust-stained pillow with no pillowcase. Pulled up near the stove was a rickety cane-bottomed rocking chair, and in it sat a little old man. He wore a very soiled and wrinkly white shirt and a scrubby brown sweater with egg stains on it. His pants were coated with floury patches of white dust, and the upper part of his shoes were starting to separate from the soles. You could see his toes through the holes. He wasn't wearing socks. On the old man's head was a wild mess of white hair with bits of twigs in it. His sideburns needed trimming, and his face was smudged with dirt. Perched askew on the man's reddish nose was a pair of rimless spectacles. His fingernails were broken and dirty, and he was clutching a tattered newspaper. Professor Childermass looked